outside at the Unity Common Ground Education Center for the 44th Annual Common Ground Country Fair. And I'm really excited today because we're going to have a make-along demonstration. I know many of you out there maybe have heard about fermenting, or maybe you've been interested in trying it, or maybe you're an expert just looking to pick up a few new skills. So this morning we're here with Wendy Watson. She is the Common Ground Kitchen Coordinator and Food Liaison for the Common Ground Country Fair in a normal year. It looked a little bit different this year, but you are a former chef and have a lot of experience with this. So tell us a little bit about how you got started with this and what you're going to do today.
So one of the things that I love doing, as well as making food and eating it, is growing it as well. And when I started growing excess cabbages in my garden, the best thing to do is turn it into sauerkraut, and then you've got food for the winter and for the coming year. So it's a great way to preserve the harvest. And so it's just one of those things where I've been doing it every year now. It's like my annual thing to do, and I get to share that all with you today, which is super exciting. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Mofka, for having me here today. So I'm hoping to demystify some of the process of lacto-fermented foods, answer questions, and demonstrate, hopefully from start to finish, what sauerkraut making in the lacto-fermented style is all about. So today I'm going to be making a fall kraut. I'm going to make a mix. It's going to be a 5-pound batch, which will have approximately 3 tablespoons of fine-grained sea salt that I'm using. And I decided I would, rather than just use a plain green cabbage, I'm going to mix it up and make both green and red, and it'll end up with a really pretty rosy pink color. And I'm going to put some apples in, local organic apples, actually wild apples, and some red onion from my garden. And I want to give a shout out to Piecemeal Farm. They were the ones that provided the cabbage for today, because my cabbage is already since gone and made into sauerkraut. So, and I'll talk at the end too about different flavor combos, additions, flavor variations, but super excited to get started. So one of the things, so hopefully some of you did get the post on Facebook. I think it was Friday night for the make along that gave you the recipe ingredients, which is 5 pounds of cabbage, whichever color that you choose, or a mixture, and then the 3 tablespoons of salt. Other things are a kitchen scale, hopefully digital. That's what I like to use. It's so super helpful for measuring, and also a little tip I'll talk about is measuring your sea salt. And then I've got a bowl to put it all in, and I'm going to be making it in jars today. You can also make it in crocks. I have like a 2-gallon crock, a 3-gallon crock at home. They're a little bit too big to transport, but I have this cute little mini 1-gallon crock that you can also get. I've got it from my local hardware store, and they're fairly inexpensive, but I wanted to use jars today because that's something that most people can get their hands on easily. So this is really kind of geared towards the first fermentation that maybe you've ever done. So hopefully you can make it along with me. And then at the end also I'll talk about some of the nifty little tools that if you get excited about and really bitten by the fermentation bug, as I have, then you too can get some of these extras. But I'm going to keep it pretty simple today, so that you can make it along. And if you aren't able to do this right in live time, you can also get this pre-recorded. So
now, as you're getting started,
yes,
just a couple reminders for folks that we are live, and so they can ask questions on Facebook Live or YouTube. So as you are watching what's going on here and you want to see and learn more, you can just put your question in and we'll answer that. And then my first question for you is actually, so to me 5 pounds of cabbage sounds like a lot, and we're going to see what it turns out to be. But if folks are making along at home, you know, how much is this going to be in the end? Is it going to fit in these 2 jars?
Yes.
Okay, so
So you'll end up with basically a 1/2 gallon. It's like 3 quarts for a 5-pound batch. When I did a 2-gallon crock full, I did a 10-pound batch, and that fits very handily in a 2-gallon. But today the 5, I'll be able to pack it in. I should be able to pack it into the half-gallon and the quart, and these are going to be used as my weights.
Okay.
So again, kind of a simple way to, without having to get a whole bunch of little gadgety things right away, unless you know that you love this and want to do it some more. But in terms of relative size, I mean, this is a pretty dense cabbage, and this, I weighed it beforehand, but this weighs approximately, it's 5 pounds, 5 ounces. And this is without any outer leaves removed, with the core. And I'm going to show you how I'm going to do that. So if I was just going to do it today with, for 5 pounds, I could probably just use this one cabbage. But I'm going to start with half of a green cabbage because it is so large. And then this one, I believe, weighs about 3 pounds, 4 ounces. So again, I'll be using some of this and some of this. And so one of the first things that you'll want to do, and I left this on just to show you, is that if you have some really bad outer leaves, definitely take those off. So if they're, you know, slug eaten or worm eaten, like some of mine were, because this was a very dry summer, then you could just take those off entirely. And but I'm going to put aside a couple of leaves that look pretty nice. Or at least marginally so, like this. You know, that's, you know, it's got a little bit of stuff on it, so I'm probably going to use the next layer. So I'm just going to peel that outer leaf off.
Now you're setting those aside. Are you going to use those later for something else?
Yes.
All right.
And I'm going to just stick it right here for now, but this will be for a little, as some people call it, a floaty trap.
Okay.
And so once the sauerkraut gets packed into the jar, this goes, I'll just probably tear it, or you can cut it to about the diameter of the inside of the jar. And then that way that keeps like any little floaty pieces of shredded cabbage or whatever else you've got in there for your ferment from reaching the air. Because as soon as a piece of plant material, whatever it's a shred of cabbage or a piece of apple or whatever, then mold has something to kind of latch onto, and we know we've got molds all over in our environment. That's not a bad thing, but you just want to keep everything under the brine. And so this is a dry salting, self-brining, lacto-fermented process. And I know that sounds like a lot of terms, but it just means that lacto is actually not about lactose, but it's about lactic acid. And it's a way to so it's referring to the lactobacillus organisms, the helpful bacteria that are doing the power work for you, which I need right now. So they're doing the job of converting sugars in the vegetables into basically lactic acid, which helps preserve your final product and also gives it that sour, tangy taste that people recognize as a dill pickle or sauerkraut. So.
And those are naturally occurring, right? So one of the great things about this whole process and what makes it so easy for folks to start trying at home is that we're not adding anything to this. This is all
right.
Naturally occurring, you know, right in what's already in the cabbage. And
right.
So that makes it a little easier.
Yeah, it is really easy. And I think, you know, if you've never done this before, it can be a little bit intimidating because it's like, well, how do I do this? And it just seems so kind of mysterious. But it's one of those things, it reminds me of bread baking, right? You know, it's like you're using some of the natural yeast in the environment, and then they're going to work and doing this like mighty job of, you know, of making the dough rise. And in this case, making this sauerkraut nice and tangy. And you're not using vinegar, you're not using heat. Those are kind of more commercial, kind of indicative of the industrial, kind of larger, kind of, we want to make everything the same kind of process. So this is definitely more kind of homemade and very safe. And I'll give you tips and tricks along the way too to make sure that you can get a good quality sauerkraut in the end. So I'm going to leave because I'm going to be using my mandolin, and not all of you may have one at home. But if you do want to get one, I recommend a wide version versus like a little handheld, because cabbage is quite large. And I found that You know, you can also use a food processor, but the food processor, you know, it just, you have to cut it to fit the feed tube, and it's kind of fussy, and you just got a whole lot more pieces to have to clean up. So I'm going to take off some of the leaves to this as well on the outside of the red cabbage. I've got one more leaf I think I'm going to pull off here. And you're just going to, because the other thing about fermentation is that you really want to start with fresh, good quality product. The only time I've ever had a ferment go bad, a sauerkraut ferment go bad, I was using some onions from my home garden, and I was using up some of the ones that had, you know, maybe a little bit of outside decomposition going on, and so I just peeled that off, got to a nice inner core of the onion that looked clean, and I actually ended up with mold towards the end of my ferment, and I'll talk about that when we get to that point. But mold is not a bad thing on the top of your ferment, and there's different types, which I can talk about later, so help me remember.
Yeah.
But a little is okay, but if it starts to smell really bad, that's not a good sign. So I'm going to just slice this one in half now, and then we'll start slicing it away on the mandolin.
So that's a good tip for folks on using the freshest, highest quality produce. I have a habit of going to the farmer's market, getting a cabbage with the intention of, great, I'm going to make some sauerkraut this week, and then the cabbage sits in the refrigerator for a week, and then 2 weeks go by, and you know, we don't want to do that. We want folks to get started right away.
It's best if you can either harvest it from your garden and then make it soon after, or go to the farmer's market, and then I would say within the week. You know, just make sure you're keeping it nice and cold in your fridge in the meantime. So one of the things that I like to do with a digital scale is that you can actually weigh, and it's nice to have a nice big bowl like this because it just gives you more room to mix. But using a digital scale, it will zero it out for you, so it can tell you like, okay, now it's at 0 with the bowl minused out. And so I can measure, as I grate, I can put it right in here and make sure I get to 5 pounds. And the other thing I want to say about weight and salt proportions is that if you're adding anything else, that is part of the 5-pound weight. And so that's important because just like even in canning, if you get the proportions out of balance, with water bath canning, you have, you know, the acid balance, and if it's not acid enough, it can spoil eventually. And so we want to make sure that you aren't going over that 5 pounds for the amount of salt that you're using. So, and because I am using the slicer mandolin, I'm also leaving the cores on. I usually don't put those in my ferment. I would cut them out if I was using a food processor because it's just, they're kind of tough, but they're actually a great safety guard if you're shredding it with the slicer here that I'm going to be using. I'm going to just set those right there for now. So let's get slicing. So in preparing for today, I haven't typically used my mandolin in the past. I've always used a food processor, but they're loud. And as I said, they're kind of a little bit of a pain because you have to cut the chunks to fit in the tube, and I time myself. I'm like, oh, if I could, you know, use my slicer and it would take me the same amount of time, and it pretty much did. But you can see how I'm holding it so that unfortunately, it does come with a little safety guard, but it doesn't work for big hunks or wedges of cabbage. So I'm using the core kind of as my handhold and just going up and down. And I'm also, this particular mandolin comes with different slicing blades, and so I'm using the thin one, and I'm going to just kind of stop a moment and show you what it looks like. So it's looking pretty nice. It's pretty thin, although I've also used it, this is a 3.5 millimeter thickness blade, and
yeah,
so
that
I've used the thicker blade, which is 7 millimeters, and that also works. But the fermentation will still work even if it's a little bit thicker. But the other thing about the food processor is that you can't really get the same uniform slices that you can with something like this. And if you have big chunks and then little strips and pieces, then then it's going to ferment at different times, and so it's nice to have. That said, I've always used a food processor, so it also works. So. You had a question.
So it looks like it's about maybe the size of like coleslaw, like when you would make coleslaw. That's the kind of consistency that folks are going for.
Yeah.
That kind of smaller shred.
Yep. And again, this batch, actually all 3 of these that I'll talk about at the end, they were all made with the thicker side. So, but you can certainly do it on the thin side. It goes a little bit more quickly.
It sounds like the key thing is uniformity. So
Yeah.
you just don't want a lot of variation in the size. You want everything to be pretty consistent.
Pretty much so, yeah. I mean, and again, if you don't have any tools, hopefully everyone's got a chef's knife, right? So you can just, be doing the slice with your chef's knife just as well as using a mandolin. So I'm trying to kind of keep it simple so that if you don't have like special tools or gadgets, that's okay. It's like you can do this at home with just a knife, a cutting board, and a scale, and the cabbage and salt. So it will still work. So right now I'm getting close to a pound. You can tell this does take a little while. Still have 4 more pounds to go here.
Now, one of the reasons people might want to do this, there's been more information about this coming out, is the health benefits of fermented products. So there's a lot of probiotics. You mentioned the lactobacillus is one of the common, like if you went to the store and you bought a supplement that was a probiotic, it's likely to have that in there. It's in, yogurt and other fermented things as well. But that's really helpful for the microbiome and the gut bacteria and helping people digest things.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's one of the benefits of doing this yourself and making fresh sauerkraut, because if you're buying a shelf-stable product, you don't have the benefits of all those healthy microorganisms that help feed your gut and are in your gut. And, we know there's a lot of information out there that we know based on kind of like the standard American diet and the industrial food system. A lot of processed foods are just, they don't make for a happy gut. And this is one way to actually increase the bioavailability of those microbes for your digestive system. It's a great digestive tonic. It makes other nutrients more bioavailable. So it's so great to know that something so simple can be like so good for you and tasty.
Yeah. And this is another good way to use up all of, what's in your garden. So cabbage is what we're demonstrating today, but really you can ferment almost any vegetable, right?
You really can. And I'm gonna, one of the things that if you take away from today, it's like, I hope you, maybe start here and then start branching out and experimenting with so many other things. Like now I annually in the late summer, I make all of my own pickles. And I didn't bring any of them. I'm sorry. I wish I had thought of that. But I do my own lacto-fermented pickles, and they're so easy. Oh my gosh! You just again, use fresh pickles, put them in a crock. That you actually make a brine for. So, so things that you're doing whole, that isn't a self-brining process like the sauerkraut, you would actually just make a brine and then pour it over, and then you can add whatever other kinds of flavor ingredients. So we're exactly 2.5 pounds. So I'm going to get started on the red cabbage next.
So while you're doing that, I'll just remind people, you mentioned water bath canning a little earlier, and actually we do have a presentation about water bath canning later today, which will be great. But just to remind people about what some of the differences are there, you know, this is a fermentation process, and it's the fermentation piece of it that's going to keep the product, you know, safe and healthy and available to eat. When you're water bath canning, you know, for folks who are just getting started or thinking about what these differences are, those are products that are not fermented. And so the water bath canning is actually the preservation method. And you add a lot of, you know, if you're making pickles, like your water bath canning pickles, you're probably going to have a vinegar brine. Like I like to make spicy dilly bean pickles that I water bath can, and so I use a vinegar brine for that versus a fermentation brine, where that's going to be something that's going to just, you know, go into the jar with the vegetables, ferment on its own, maybe, you know, in the open room temperature air or in the refrigerator, and then that's going to keep. And I'm not going to can that because that heat is going to kill that live, you know, probiotic bacteria that's in there that's really healthy for you.
Exactly. It's kind of like for people who are familiar with miso, that's another live product, and I never try to cook with that. I will add it at the end of cooking so that it doesn't basically destroy the healthy bacteria that are in that live product. And I've started doing lacto-fermented dilly beans too. The one drawback is that if you don't have a root cellar to store all these things in, then you basically need to put it in your refrigerator when the ferment is done. Fortunately, I do have a root cellar, so I just keep what I'm going to be eating in my fridge, and then the rest of it will go into the root cellar, and that usually stays, you know, right now it's like 50. It's still not that cold out down in the root cellar yet, but it's cooler than my outside, and I can't make room in my refrigerator for all my fermented foods. Holy cow. I was actually borrowing a neighbor's fridge for a little while until the root cellar got at least down to 50. All right, so we got 2.5 pounds of the green cabbage. Now we're adding the red. That was about a pound there. I think I'm going to just take a little break from the cabbage, and I'm going to do the onion. I'm going to leave this whole, well, let's see. I'm going to just do some half moon slices of this, because I want to make sure that I add in my other ingredients before I get to the 5 pounds of just cabbage only, unless that's what you're doing. That's fine too.
So this is, you know, looks like it's becoming quite a large quantity here, and I know it's going to get kind of pounded down a little bit.
Yes.
But one of the other great things about this method is that if people only have one cabbage, as long as they're doing it proportionally, you can make just a quart jar of this kind of sauerkraut.
Yep.
So whatever quantity you have at home or you have on hand, as long as you keep the proportions right, people can really scale that to whatever size they want to do.
Yeah, if you want to just start with a quart, I believe what you would need is about 1.75 pounds of finished product. So that would be cabbage and whatever else you want to put in there. And then a tablespoon of salt. And this might be a good time to talk about salt, actually. So there are many different kinds of salt out there that you could use, and I'm going to talk about what I love to use the most, which is a mineral salt. And I happen to use this Redmond Real Salt, and it's a fine grain and full of minerals as well as sodium and chloride, so it's kind of a more, what I would call a natural salt. And I think it also helps with provide a little bit more nutrients to the microbes that are doing the work. It gives it a more well-rounded flavor. And so, like, you can either use like a Himalayan pink salt, but this is a really blocky grain. You would need to use something finer than that, but that's also a perfectly good mineral sea salt to use. And so the salt also acts as the preservative and helps the whole fermentation process get going. So if you were trying to do like a no salt ferment, it's not going to work, and you're going to end up with like brown mush probably. And so the salt will actually help the microbes do their work. And so you want to make sure that, and if you're using something like a refined sea salt, some of those salts have additives in them, and you don't want that. So you want to have something without iodine, hopefully fine grain. Kosher salt works, although it too has been stripped of any kind of minerals, and so the salts that don't have any additives but are just straight up like sodium chloride, they're going to taste maybe a little bit more salty than if you were using a mineral salt, because the sodium chloride in a mineral salt is like 97%. And if you were using a regular kind of refined commercial salt, that's going to be more like 99% sodium chloride. So I'm going to use the grater for these and just give them a quick grate. You could also chop them if you'd like as well.
Now, are the apples for flavor?
Yeah, this is you can both use all sorts of different vegetables when you're fermenting, as well as fruit. And I'm just using this mostly for flavor and a little contrast, and that's why I call this the fall kraut, because it's basically, the apples are in season now, the cabbage of course is, and the onions most people have harvested their onions now, and they're very common and available at the farmer's market and so forth. So I'm just going to go straight to the apple, and I'm not even going to cut it up.
Now, are there any combinations that you might not want to try? So I see maybe over there you've got some carrots and cabbage. I've heard of beets and carrots, and there's lots of different combinations that as people start exploring this more, they can test out. But is there anything that just really doesn't work in terms of combinations?
Well, the flavor combinations are really just as, what you like and what you might want to do. And people who know me know that I have a hard time doing things just kind of plain and simple. So I always like to spice it up. And that could be with just other vegetables or fruit. The other thing, both carrots and beets have a high sugar content, so I try to be careful with adding, not adding too much of those. And the only other ferment that ever kind of went funky on me was I love fermented carrots, and I did a grated carrot, ginger, turmeric ferment, and after 1 week I went to check it, and it was slimy.
Oh.
And I found out afterwards, because I have to say there's no such thing as failure when you're doing fermentation, because you can learn from that, and that's kind of how I look at it. But you can rinse it and still eat it, but the kind of the ick factor of the slime. But it's because the sugars are high in carrots. And I do another thing that I'll talk about, I'll just reference briefly, is something called beet kvass. And that's amazing. I love that, and I can't wait to make it this fall. I haven't made a batch of it for this year.
And that's a beverage, right?
It is a beverage, and you make it with cut up beets. You leave the skins on, you scrub it. So I want to just check my weight. I only need 3 more ounces.
Oh, perfect.
Well, actually a few more. Maybe it's more like 8. So I'm just taking the whole hunk of cabbage here, and I'm doing a little bit of grating, and we're going to go back to slicing. So beet kvass is kind of an Eastern European drink or beverage that also is lacto fermented. So you make a brine and you pour it over the chopped up beets, and you just basically let it sit for a week or two, and it will ferment on its own, and then and you just basically let it go until it's your liking, and you can add other things to it. I've done grated fresh ginger, and I'll talk about that with the flavor combos too, because ginger is another great addition, and I love ginger.
Yeah.
And so I put it in a lot of my ferments, and there we go. I just think I nicked myself, but that's okay because it's right towards the end. How are we doing here? All right, we got about 5 pounds, so perfect.
Perfect.
I'm gonna put this away.
Yep, and you know, just to remind everybody, we want everybody to be safe while they're doing this too, and you know, to keep an eye on your fingers as you're getting close on the slicer or the grater or with a knife. I mean, all of them are can be prone to accidents and cuts. So just remind everybody to that, and obviously you want to be safe when you're working in the kitchen. I know another like fermented product that a lot of people I think have been trying at home, and maybe it's been even more popular this last 6 months as a home project, has been kombucha. And it's sort of a similar idea, right? That I know that there's a mother. So we had a vinegar making demonstration on Friday, actually, and anybody who wants to see that can go see that. But it's the same idea that we're using the natural bacteria, whether in cider, it's a mother, and kombucha, I think it's called a SCOBY. But you're going to take some fresh product, tea, and you can add ginger, fruit, or other things, and you're going to let that ferment, and the natural bacteria that are part of that mother are going to do that work to create that fermented beverage, and that adds a lot of the same great kind of probiotics that folks are looking for these days to be healthy.
So I'm a great kombucha fan. I've been making it consistently for years now, and I love it. It's really. And in the summertime, when there's lots of fresh product around, whether it's fruit or herbs and so forth, it's just delightful. So now I've got my 5 pounds all prepped and ready to go, and I'm going to measure out the salt. And the salt we want to measure because there is a wide variation of weights of salt. And also there's a variation even in terms of a tablespoon. And so this is one of the little tips that I learned recently, that I've never weighed my salt. I've always measured it. And I was starting to wonder, like, why does one ferment batch taste a little bit saltier than another? And the way to get really consistent results with your kind of that saltiness, so it's just the right amount. And this is 3 tablespoons, 15 milliliters each, basically are what makes for like a perfect 2% salinity. So
yeah, and the reason that they might be different weights is based on the size of the grain of salt, right? And how much air might be between those.
Right.
So just like in baking, I know measuring things is really important, and you know, this helps with that as well. So it's interesting. I had never thought of measuring salt for fermentation.
Right. Me either. And I thought, wow, that's a really great idea. And that way you can get more consistent results.
So you're doing 3 tablespoons.
Yep, and it's 15. It's 15 grams. Sorry, I said
15
milliliters.
grams.
Yeah, 15 grams.
Right, and just like with the bowl, you weighed the spoons first and then zeroed it out. So all you're getting is the 15 grams of salt there.
Exactly. And another thing to know too is that fermentation, there's 3 different levers that can be kind of played with that, and also are influenced in your final ferment. One is time, one is temperature, and one is salinity. And so we're controlling the salinity right now by measuring the salt and getting to basically 15 grams for each tablespoon that I'm using. And I'm afraid I'm still bleeding. Do you have some towel?
We can definitely
Okay.
grab a towel for you.
Thank you.
And
I don't wanna be a mess here.
yeah, and I don't know if the camera can actually see this, but with the salt here, it's interesting because the tablespoon isn't full, but as you were talking about with weighing it, the 15 grams, you get a more specific and accurate measure here for what you're going to be adding in.
Exactly.
And it's just such a great visual just to see and show that it really is makes a difference.
So I'm going to do a one-handed mix because I've got a little bit of my nick on the slicing blade. So
Great, and here's
okay, great.
towel.
Thank you. Actually, you know what would be great? Could you give me a plastic glove?
Yeah.
That would be awesome. And then I can kind of go to town with both hands. And if you want to get me two, that would be super duper.
All right, we will make that happen.
This is live cooking at its best.
Gloves. She cut herself. Plastic gloves.
So the thing that you want to be doing now that I'm doing is massaging your ferment. This is where the salt is going to get mixed in with your cabbage, and it will start kind of pulling out the water through osmosis from the cabbage. And so you want to be able to, usually it's best just to, you know, with clean hands, which mine are before I did this. Anyways, then you can just mix with your hands. You can also sprinkle the salt on it, give it a mix, and then kind of cover it and come back in an hour. And that way it does the work for you. But at this point, this is a great, thank you so much, Sarah, I appreciate it.
Yeah, and here's another towel.
Okay,
You need that.
perfect.
And so we've got some gloves here,
Oh, righty.
and maybe I'll put some on too here, just in case you need an extra hand. I
All right.
can help out.
Thank you.
We can swap off. Now, does it take a lot of upper body strength? We're going to do some pounding probably too, right? Does it take a lot of strength?
I don't, you can pound, but mostly what I do, I am pounding the ferment into the jar versus just pounding it right now.
Oh, okay.
And I'm trying to get the glove on wet fingers.
Yeah. Can I do some mixing with my gloved
yeah,
hands?
please go
while-
right in here.
So I'll just step in here.
And you can just start massaging it.
All right.
It doesn't require a lot of upper body strength. It's just, it's kind of a little bit like, you know, kneading bread dough. And you're just basically just mixing it all together.
Smells good. I can smell the onion in there.
Mm-hmm.
And we're trying to get the salt kind of all mixed around.
That's right. Yeah. All right, I'm gonna let Sarah keep.
All right. And you can instruct me. I've made sauerkraut before, but I actually haven't made this quite large of a batch. So this is a new experience. I've just made a small batch that I can put in a quart jar.
Okay, all right, that's fine. I chance to get my gloves on.
As I'm mixing it, I'm just making sure I'm getting everything mixed in here because there are some little pouches of like green cabbage that pop up every once in a while. So I'm clear that I haven't actually gotten it fully mixed in.
Thanks for stepping in there, Sarah.
Yeah, teamwork.
That's right.
It's always more fun to make food with other people. Make food together.
Exactly.
All right, you ready to take over here?
I am. Thank
All right,
you.
I'll step away.
All right, very good. So now that you've had a chance to mix it up, thanks to Sarah, then we're gonna actually pack it into jars. So, and you don't need a fun little tamper like this to do it, but it's one of those kind of cool little tool gadgety things for fermenting. I brought a spoon. Everyone's probably has a wooden spoon at home, so you can certainly use that. but we're going to take this and put it right in the jar now. I have a wide mouth funnel.
Now, did you have to sanitize your jars ahead of time?
I always start with clean jars. I usually just use hot water and soap.
Okay.
I don't, like in water bath canning, since you've got the kettle going, I will sanitize, and sterilize, I should say, my jars prior to canning in them. But I have found that if your surfaces are clean, your hands are clean, again, it's all about the mighty microbes, and the salt helps to make a good blend of things. So you've got a wide end and a narrow end, and depending upon your size jar, I could probably use this one without the wide mouth. So you want to pack it in as best as possible. And you can use your fist if you are more comfortable with that.
And if you're using a crock or something where you had a larger opening to it, might be. Oh, that's what the really big one's for.
This is the tool, the wooden plunger, cabbage stomper for your big sauerkraut crock. And it's really helpful because you can lean on it and just have the crock on the ground and just like put your weight on it. Ah! All right. Well, it looks like the ferment is still in good shape, so we're okay.
All right.
There was one other.
Yep, there's one more down here.
All right. Well, live demos at their best. We're dealing with the elements here.
Right,
and,
we've got the wind.
All righty. So I'm about to put more in here. And so it's all about packing it down because you want to basically get rid of as many air pockets as possible for the ferment to do its thing. And you're actually, I don't know if you can see this, but I'm going to move some of this over so you can. But there's some brine now that's starting to form. So when I push on this, you can see, look at that pretty colored brine.
Yeah, it's beautiful purple.
It's a great color. And that's what you're looking for, is that juice or brine. And so it's already doing its work here. And I must say too, that doing the finer grate that we used on the slicer there, the finer slicing, it will start to do this a little bit more quickly and easily than if it's a kind of a wider or thicker kind of cut. So that's another advantage.
And part of packing it down is making sure we get a lot of the air bubbles out, right? You don't want any air in there.
That's right. And you want to have the brine come up over the final product in your jar. And so I'm really pleased seeing how good it looks. It must be from all of your great massaging that you did, Sarah.
Well, I could tell those were really healthy, nice cabbages. A lot of moisture in there too, because they're fresh. And like we were talking about earlier, using that really high quality, local organic produce from your local farms or from your garden, that's really going to help with the quality as well.
Exactly. And I would say if you had a really dry cabbage, you're not going to get this kind of juice. So I'm going to stop here. Actually, I might even just take just a pinch out. You want to make sure that you leave headspace, partly because you're going to be putting a weight, which I'm using one of these jars as a weight, and it fits. So this is like a little jelly or jam jar that you can find in the supermarket or hardware store, and I use that as my weight. And so you want to leave like an inch, about an inch, no more than 2, to basically get that in there, and so that you can have the brine and the weight. So when you put the weight on there, you don't want the brine to be up over the top. So, and now I'm going to talk about the final piece, which is a piece of your cabbage, actually, from earlier. That's why I set the pieces aside that are good quality. And so you can basically just tear it and to be about the right size to fit on the top. And what this does is basically act as a trap to keep all the loose pieces down below the brine. And this is like a great simple way to do that. There's also something called a pickle weight, which you can put in there, or one of these. Those are kind of like fun little things. But this will work, and you want to make sure that there aren't any pieces of sauerkraut up along the outside edge above that, because that too can also attract mold organisms. But so you're basically just putting that in just like that, and now you can take the jar, and you don't need the lid on that. And I had another, there's the lid.
Oh, so it's the lid that's going to hold down the weight. I see.
Yep, exactly. So here is your finished sauerkraut. And so these two are still working. I can put the rest of this away after we're done. But I'll talk about just some of the different combinations that I've done in the past, and maybe give you some ideas of things you might want to try. So this is what I called a summer kraut. And basically it's just green cabbage, of course sea salt, and some grated carrot, and some chopped garlic. And whoa, was that ever pungent and fragrant when I first started it. But the garlic really mellows over time. And by the end, this is actually finished. I took it out of my crock this morning to bring it and show you all. And I tasted it too. And this is 3 weeks, and there's brine in here, and it was like the perfect amount of tang, and it's nice and crunchy. So that's what you're looking for. So when you get to the point of when you first ferment, again, the first 3 days are kind of crucial. You don't want to disturb it. You want to put it someplace out of your way, but not where you're going to forget it. And you're going to just let it sit for the first week. Because that first week, the organisms are really getting busy doing their thing. They're converting, they're basically converting, things like into lactic acid and helping it to ferment and bringing the pH down. So I don't recommend trying to taste it in the first week, but just keep an eye on it, like on a daily basis, just to make sure. And another thing that I recommend, put your jar in a bowl or a plate or some kind of dish to catch the ferment happening, because it'll start the types of lactobacilli bacteria that are in there the first 3 days or so. They're basically getting busy just doing the ferment and doing like the real work in the beginning, and you'll see lots of bubbles, and then you might see some like liquid coming out, and that's okay. But I don't want it on my counter or on my floor, so I put it in a tub if it's a big crock, or just a little bowl.
So we've actually had a ton of questions coming in while we've been doing this. So let's go to a few questions. So the first one is from Hannah, who asks, do you worry about live yeast from the apples, and do you need to adjust the salt to account for that? So if you weren't using the apples, would you use a different amount of salt?
I haven't. I mean, I've made sauerkraut before with apples. I just don't use a large proportion of them, so it's just a little bit to add some sweetness and a little contrast to the flavor profile, but I've never found that I've needed to adjust the salt for that.
Okay. And Tracy and Alina actually had sort of similar questions. So Tracy says, the deer ate my green cabbage. Can I use only red cabbage? And Alina wants to know, is there a variety of cabbage that's better to use for sauerkraut?
I don't really think that there's a better variety of cabbage. I think whatever you can get will work. And I'll just show you, this is my beet red sauerkraut, and this is nothing but red cabbage and a grated beet. And so it just comes out really, really dark, and you can see it's stained the wood because it's still fermenting. This is on like week 2 now. This was 3 weeks that's done. And then of course we just finished that one today. So you can use like all red, and it doesn't really matter what variety you use.
Okay. Yep. And then Dee asks, can pink Himalayan salt be substituted for the sea salt?
Most definitely, but just try to get it in something in a fine grain, or if you have a way to grate it. I mean, some people have like a salt mill, because you don't want to use the big chunks of whatever kind of salt you're using. Even kosher salt can be a little bit large crystal for the ferment. It just takes longer to distribute and is not as ideal as the fine grain.
Okay. And Barbara asks, she says she's been told that like with sourdough, metal should not be used, and obviously we used a metal bowl, so is that okay, or is it just that it can't be stored in metal? And then actually on the jar lids, you know, I know a lot of us have the metal tops that we use from water bath canning, and you have these nice reusable lids. So is it possible, how does metal play into this? Can you use it in the jars and in the prep?
Well, I've never had a problem with any of my ferments when I use a metal bowl. It's not like kombucha, like the SCOBY is not supposed to come in contact with metal. But with sauerkraut, everyone I know, and myself included in terms of my own experience, it's not a problem doing it. I mean, some people use food-safe plastic to put their ferments in, which I don't particularly care for. I'd rather use glass. But I don't think I would put it in metal, but I don't have any reference of why that might not be a good thing. And using the metal wide mouth funnel, again, not an issue. But I think glass is the best storage vehicle to put it in. And you can use, since that inner jar does not have a lid, and if all you have, I mean, I get these too at the hardware store, but if all you have are the regular water bath canning lids, that's fine too. You just might notice a little bit of corrosion from the salt on the inside of the metal band when you take it off. So just make sure you don't. Yeah.
And do you want to put the lid as tight as it goes? Do you want to leave a little space for air to escape, or how do you do that?
I wouldn't crank on it. And try to get it as hard as possible. And as long as you're leaving enough room between the ferment that's below the brine and the jar and getting the lid on, you should be okay. Because as I said, like these two have been going now for 2 weeks, and I've had no issue with anything else with that. So you could use a metal one. For storage, again, you're going to have to look at, for long-term storage, if you have only metal bands and lids, the salt can eventually, you know, do some corrosion on it, but it's perfectly fine inside.
Okay. Steven asks, he says, I blanched and froze cabbage to store it. Can I still make sauerkraut out of that?
Well, that's going to be a whole different thing. The texture is going to be different. The tissues break down when you freeze things, and so it may end up being too mushy. I've never experimented using frozen and blanched product in a live ferment, and sorry about the pun, but my gut senses that it may not work so well.
So a few folks asked about spices. Martha asked, do you add caraway seed, which is a Lithuanian touch? And Krista was asking about Central American traditions of putting different color layers in the jar. But, you know, what kinds of different spices and things can you add that might give it different flavors from around the world?
Sure. Well, this one is a golden kraut, and this one has turmeric and grated fresh ginger, and so that, and also garlic and black pepper. That because black pepper helps the curcumin in the turmeric, and so that makes it more bioavailable. And then the beet red kraut that I made, I used caraway, dill, celery seed in there. Also some juniper berries, which you can crush or use whole. They help flavor the ferment. But by all means, I mean, you can make, you can add some cilantro, you could add parsley, so other fresh herbs can be added. I've never tried layering. The only thing that would be difficult with that would be making sure that everything is mixed equally with the brine. So you'd have to have like little bits, I would think, of different, yeah, that would be an experiment.
Okay.
I haven't done that before.
Laura on YouTube is just asking you to explain again why we need to be careful about high sugar vegetables like carrots and beets.
Yeah, when you're doing especially a ferment with only carrots or only beets that are grated especially, they have a high sugar content, so it tends to favor a different type of yeast. So I'm sorry, a different type of bacteria, and they go a little nuts. It's like they're having a big party in there with all the sugar content that's higher in beets and carrots. So that's why if you're doing a ferment with only carrots or like a grated beet, something or other like a ferment with just grated beets, you'll probably want to do that for a lot shorter period of time. I think I did my grated carrot, turmeric, and ginger ferment for about a week, and it was already kind of getting slimy by then. So again, those are just a little trickier because of the high sugar content and the different type of bacterial strains that really enjoy that.
Great. And we might have a lot of first-time people who are making it today, and we had somebody on YouTube who said, I've made a kraut a couple weeks ago, but I've abandoned it. It's my first kraut, so I'm intimidated. And they ask, how can I look it straight in the eye and do what I need to do? So does that mean, you know, can they revive it? Should they compost it? How is somebody going to know when it's actually ready?
Really good question. I'm glad that that's one of the last questions that we may have time for, because this is where I think people get really nervous. Like, is it done? Is it bad? You know, how do I tell the difference? And when it's done, it should smell kind of somewhat mellow, a little bit, you know, a little bit of pungent smell, but it's going to have settled down from the beginning. And visually, you want to look at it visually. You want to smell it. And there's something called calm yeast, and that's K-A-H-M, which is like a white film of yeast that may form on the surface, and that's not a bad thing, but you can skim it off. The only time that, as I mentioned earlier, that the only time I've ever had a ferment that I felt like went south, it actually had colored mold and it smelled bad. And even if I wanted to skim off the little bit of colored mold, which I could have done, I couldn't get past the smell factor. And I thought, okay, the combination of both of those, like and I have a pretty sensitive nose, you know, my husband knows that. So if I can't want to enjoy it because it smells too pungent or like bad and it's got mold growing on it, but if she's got a ferment that's only several weeks old, it's probably still fine. Again, it's like and she can also take it out and maybe just take a little taste and see how it tastes. So
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we've learned so much today. We're so excited. I'm going to come over to this side as we get ready to go to our next segment here. But thank you so much, Wendy, for sharing all of your knowledge. This was so fun to get to do this together out here. And what a beautiful jar of sauerkraut that we made. And I hope that it tastes as good as it looks, and that maybe we'll get to taste test it in a week or so. Yeah, we'll try it out here at the office. Well, thanks so much. And next we're going to go to Beth, who's going to share a little bit more about the Common Ground Country Fair Country Store.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks.